One of the biggest challenges in chess isn't just finding good moves, it's knowing how to create a plan. In this video, I'll show you how to come up with strong logical plans that fit any position. You'll learn what to look for in a position, how to identify key ideas, find the best candidate moves, and turn your plans into real results on the board. By the end, you'll be able to build better plans, play with confidence, and win more games. Let's get started. I want to start this video off by mentioning that a bad plan is always going to be better than no plan. Some of you are beginners at this game, some of you are going to be a bit more advanced, but it doesn't matter what elo you are, even if you are 500 or if you're in 1800, you should still be coming up with a plan even if that plan is wrong. Coming up with a plan regardless teaches you how to think in chess and how to stay disciplined in your thought process. And eventually your plans are going to get better and better. I see a lot of players neglect this and just play a random move and hope that their opponent makes a mistake. Even higher level players, I've seen 2000s do this. And of course, not only this doesn't help you, but it also develops bad habits and it's not going to be good for your long-term chess growth. And of course, this goes without saying, avoid blitz and bullet completely and play rapid, preferably with increment like 15 plus 10, for example. Because in blitz and bullet, you don't have time to come up with plans and you're just learning how to play fast. But if you want to learn how to play well, you need to slow down and actually think and come up with ideas. Second point that I want to mention is that a good plan should do one of two things. It has to either improve your position, such as piece activity, or it has to worsen your opponent's position, for example, not allow them to develop all of their pieces if possible. So whenever you're coming up with a plan, ask yourself this question. Is what I'm about to do going to make my position better, or is it going to make my opponent's position worse? If the answer is no to both of those questions, chances are your plan is not correct. With that being said, let's start by talking about piece activity. Okay, now I'm going to show you a couple of games that I played, but before I do that, I want to unpack certain terms. When we say that one side has a better position, so in this case, when we say that black, for example, has a better position, what do we actually mean by that? What are the criteria that determine black being better in this position? Well, there are two, and those are king safety and piece activity. Those are the two criteria that determine that black has a better position. In this case, both sides have sort of weak kings. I would argue white's king is actually slightly weaker, but that can be up to debate. But the real difference here is that black has better piece activity and it's actually much easier for black to develop his pieces. For example, black can move the rooks to c8 and g8 on semi-open files, and that would be considered just a very nice development. But white does not have that luxury because of the way he placed his pieces. The queen is blocking the bishop is blocking the rook, this bishop is blocking the pawn, and even if you move the pawn, the rook would be hanging. So as you can see, white's pieces are sort of clumped up and they cannot be developed so effectively. So every plan that you make should be based on activating or improving your pieces. And that can be as simple as simply bringing the rooks to semi-open files. Not all plans have to be complicated. Finished development can also be a very nice plan. The real trick comes from the fact that developing in different openings is, well, simply different. So you cannot develop the same way in every single opening, but you should be coming up with plans that make your pieces as good as possible. Now I will take you through the thought process that I had and show you the ideas and the plans that I was coming up with. So in this position, it's white to move. I was playing with the black pieces. My opponent played knight to f5. He's attacking the pawn on d6 because it's only defended by the queen. The pawn is currently pinned to the king. I played e6, dealing with this threat, and my opponent played bishop to h4. It's important to understand what my opponent's plan was with this move. His plan was to develop his bishop and his rook. The problem is that is very difficult to accomplish here because he either has to move the queen away to get the bishop out and then get the rook out, or he has to move the bishop, then move the rook, the pawn, and get the bishop out this way, which is what he ended up going for, but it did cost him the game, but the position was already bad. So his idea was to just simply develop, but it was just not enough because of how good my position is at this stage. So in this case, what I wanted to do was just simply activate my pieces. My plan is to improve my position as much as possible, and that can easily be done by bringing in the pieces that have not been developed yet. So I played rook to c8, rook a to c8. I have pressure here. Opponent plays rook g1. Now I played rook to g8. I activated both of my rooks on semi-open files. And one thing you have to remember is that after a while, after you develop all your pieces and your opponent is lacking in development and his pieces are kind of awkward, you're going to notice that there's always going to be something that cracks in your opponent's position, and there's always going to be some sort of a tactical shot. So in this position, I was able to find that tactical shot. I played this move, bishop to f3. The bishop skewers the queen and the rook, and also it cannot be taken because queen takes c2 is simply checkmate. So in this case, I'm winning an exchange. My opponent moved the queen, of course, to defend the rook, and I didn't even take the rook. I took the pawn on g4 because I'm still threatening this. I'm still threatening this as well, and I'm also threatening the knight if my rook is captured. So I'm threatening all of these pieces all at the same time, and there's no threat here because I'm just simply gonna take and then take the rook, and that's not an issue whatsoever. So after a couple of moves, my opponent ended up resigning the game. He just allowed me to get this rook here on g1, but there was nothing he could have done here regardless. So best plan is to activate your pieces and make them as good as possible, and I will show you another example of that. Okay, now let's talk about this position right here. I'm actually up a pawn, however, my opponent has the big center and this position is quite difficult for me to deal with. So of course, I need to get my pieces out and castle my king. Now, in this game, I did not choose to play knight to f3. I actually chose to go knight h3 instead. And my plan with this move was that I would be able to go to f4 in the future and pressure this pawn on e6 as well as this pawn on d5. And I want you guys to notice how this piece right here is aiming at d5, also the bishop, and the knight that's about to arrive here will also be eyeing this d5 pawn, and you will see how I used that in a moment. My opponent played a6, I castled, a takes b5, knight takes b5, knight to c6. My opponent is giving me the bishop pair. However, I thought about this position. I actually thought a while on this position, and I ended up not taking this bishop, and it was the correct decision. Instead, I played this move e4, and you might as well give this 2 exclamation points because this is a very, very nice move because I'm cracking the center and I'm activating my bishop. You see how, let's just make a random move. If opponent plays h6 or something after takes, now this pawn is properly under attack, because earlier it's not under attack here because the pawn on e6 is defending the pawn on d5. So the bishop's pressure, yes, it still has pressure, but it's limited because this is defending. However, the e pawn is the pawn that captures the pawn on d5 and tips the scale in my favor. So I ended up playing e4, which was one of the top computer moves. I'm not sure if it was the best move or the second best move, but it was one of the top moves. And my opponent here played bishop to e5, moving the bishop out of the way. He did not want to give up the bishop pair. However, I captured here on d5 and I went knight to f4. And remember earlier I said that a lot of pieces are aiming at d5. Well, now it's a huge problem. The pawn is under attack and my opponent is forced to pretty much capture this knight on f4. I captured back, and now what's crazy is that I am threatening both of these pawns tactically. I'm threatening knight to c7, which would attack the rook and also attack this pawn, would triple attack the pawn on d5. I'm also threatening bishop d6, which would hit this rook and this pawn. So I'm actually threatening both of these pawns. My opponent chose to defend this one right here, but he neglected the one on c5. He could not have possibly defended both, and I managed to end up winning this game. So I'm not going to show the whole game until the end. You guys can check this game out. The link to the study is in the description. But the main thing is this all stemmed from the fact that I developed correctly and I was able to formulate an idea, and I was able to formulate and coordinate my pieces to attack a certain square. In this case, that was the d5 square, and I managed to win this game because of that reason. So your plans should be based around weak squares or any entry points where you can build up the pressure. All of my pieces are aiming towards d5, and I was able to pressure and attack d5 because of this move e4 later on. And if my opponent had pushed the pawn to d4, I know a lot of people are going to ask this question. That's why I want to include this detail. So what if my opponent plays d4? This is a very good judgment. This is a move that is a legitimate move, and your opponents can play this. In this case, this weakens e6. It weakens the diagonal, so I can go queen b3, knight g5, moves like that, and I can put tremendous pressure on this pawn on e6. I'm not sure whether this is the best right away or takes first or knight. Yeah, or knight g5, queen b3, just basically attacking this pawn one way or another. I just want to include this because I know someone will ask about it in the comments. Now I will show you what happens when you don't try to improve your pieces and when your plan is to just simply move the queen around, or you don't have a plan at all and you just keep moving pieces. I don't want to waste the whole video on just one game, so I will just go through the opening fairly quickly. It was Queen's Gambit, and it was this weird variation, and here I just simply developed my pieces. After captures, I played knight c3. The pawn is pinned, so the knight cannot be taken, and after a couple of moves, I ended up getting to this position right here. So as you can see, I'm not worried about the pawn on b2. I gave my opponent the pawn, but he made so many moves with his queen. Let's count how many moves he made. He played one move, queen d5, that's 2, then that is 3, and now this is the 4th queen move he's making while I'm busy developing my pieces. And after rook to c1, knight d7, bishop c4, as you can see, I'm just getting my pieces out. I defended my knight, then I got out my bishop, and all I'm doing here is I'm just developing my pieces. My opponent plays e5, and what happens here is that he gets into trouble. I actually ended up playing knight to d6 in this position. He played a king to e7. I went back, and now I castled. I was about to say I captured this pawn. I did capture this pawn, but I did it later on. But first I sacrificed this knight because I knew that once my opponent would take it, I would play this move right here, queen to d6, threatening checkmate on e7. And my opponent played bishop to b4, and then I captured the pawn on g7. Opponent is forced to go to d8, and then bishop to b6 is simply checkmate. So what you guys need to notice here is that my opponent never moved the rook, never moved the other rook, and he never moved the light square bishop. And your plan cannot be to simply just move around, do nothing, try to take as much material as possible. It's gonna probably work at lower elos, but as you get better and better and better, you need to prioritize piece activity. You need to prioritize getting the pieces out as much as possible. That should be your plan, and that should be your goal ultimately. So because of the fact that my opponent never developed properly, I was able to execute my plan of just simply swarming him because he doesn't have enough resources ready to counter my threats, and I ended up winning the game because of that reason. Okay, now I want to talk to you guys about a specific idea, and that idea is that you don't always have to stick to your plans 100%. Sometimes it's actually very good to change your plans midway through depending on what your opponents play. So in this position, for example, I captured the bishop on d7 just to trade pieces because I am up a pawn in this position, and I looked at this position and realized that, okay, my opponent has almost all of his, not almost, but all of his pieces developed, but his most active piece is this knight on f4. So let me go knight to e2 in order to trade my knight for his knight, because I didn't want to trade my bishop. I like bishops more than knights, so I wanted to trade my knight for this bishop. My opponent played g5 here, defending this knight, and I was like, okay, so g5 weakens the f5 square. I don't want to take on f4 anymore. I do not want to trade knight for knight anymore. f4, what I'm gonna do is actually now I'm gonna change my plan and go to g3 and f5 instead. And that is exactly what I did. I went knight g3, queen d6, knight to f5. And now, as you can see, I can at any point I want trade this bishop for knight. And earlier I did not want to make that trade because I like bishops more than knights. However, in this case, I can do that because I will be left with a strong knight, an outposted knight versus a bad bishop. And this is a prime example of good knight versus bad bishop scenario. My opponent played a couple of moves. I just defended a couple of threats, and then I traded the queens. I offered this queen trade because there's not much my opponent can do. If my opponent goes back, my idea was actually to just trap the knight with g3. So this is a forced queen trade. Queen d1 is a forced queen trade if he goes back. Actually, no, he can go to h5. I did forget about that. But anyways, though, it's a queen trade offer. My opponent obliged, he traded the queens, and we got into this scenario. Now I have this good knight versus bad bishop, and that is because I changed my plan earlier, and I was able to convert this game very beautifully. Actually, it was not the best conversion, but it was okay. I captured the knight on f4. The details are not really that relevant here. What I want you guys to understand is the point that I made, which is that you need to sometimes change your plan. I will just show the rest of the game just as a formality. And yeah, this is what happened. I used the pin here to win the pawn on c5, traded the rooks, and ended up winning the bishop in a couple of moves. Okay, now let's talk about how to come up with candidate moves. So let's take a look at this position right here. The first thing that stands out to me are these two rooks right here because they're still on their home squares. Well, this one was castled on f1, but they are not developed and we should develop them. Now, there are no really great squares for these rooks right away. We can develop the f rook to e1, to c1. We can develop the a rook to b1, to c1, but it's not very clear why we want to do that. For example, if you set up the position properly, if you play a move like e3 and then play a pawn break like c4, you could activate the rook on the c file, but you would also be opening up this bishop right here. So to me, there are no clear ways of developing these rooks right away. So then I would have to improve one of my other pieces. Okay, so let's take a look at this knight. Where on the board would this knight be very strong? And the answer to that question is f4. Why is this square so special here? That is because, first of all, it's a weak square. We know that squares in front of the double isolated pawns are weak. Check out my doubled pawns video to learn more about that. But what we can do here is try to remaneuver the knight to f4. And there are multiple ways to do that, but once you figure out that you can occupy this square with the knight and it is actually going to be very strong there, you will start to realize, and the candidate moves will come to you. You're going to realize that knight h4 is a candidate move in order to go to g2 and get to f4 this way, and you will also realize that knight e1 is also a candidate move, and you're trying to go to d3 and then try to go to f4. Knight e1 is weaker though because there's a bishop a6 and there are some tactical issues here, but knight h4 is definitely a very nice move. So you have to identify pieces that are not developed and try to develop them, and that's how you come up with candidate moves. You have to identify how to improve your pieces, and that is another way that you can identify candidate moves. There are some other ways. For example, a more advanced way to play this position would be to do something like a4 with the idea of playing a5. Let me just make a random move, which is like king to g7. What does this move do, a4, a5? What it does is it gets rid of your isolated pawn, which traditionally is a weakness, and also it activates your rook even without moving it. Now, there are some upsides and downsides to this. For example, if you capture this, first of all, you have to defend this pawn, but let me just move the king back just to illustrate a point. If you capture this pawn on b6, you might be allowing your opponent to get a passed a pawn. We know that outside passed pawns are dangerous, and also the open c file does benefit the black pieces. If I open up the computer here, we might see that both of these moves are legit. Personally, I think c takes b6 is practically better here. It opens up the c file for the black rook. It gives black the outside passed pawn. So you have to be very careful, and you have to improve your position in the correct way. You do not just want to be making random moves. Based on the information that I just showed you, try to improve your pieces, try to identify weak squares, and once you do that, candidate moves will come to you. Now I will give you guys a couple of rules that will help you find the candidate moves. First of all, you need to play on the side where you are stronger. So in this position, white has the 3-on-2 on the queen side, black has 4-on-3 on the king side. White should be trying to push the pawns over here and try to create a passed pawn, and black should be trying to push the pawns over here, trying to create a passed pawn in the center of the board, exchanging these f and e pawns for this f pawn ideally. Now a candidate moves in this position would be something like activating the king, bringing the bishop to a better square, or also just playing c5 and blocking out this bishop even further. So these are all the ideas that you have to understand, but make sure to play on the side where you're stronger. Try to create a passed pawn. If you have a 3-on-2, push them. If you have a 4-on-3, push them. Push those pawns, and in general, play on the side where you are stronger. Let me show you another rule. Now, this one is what I like to call the rule of the chain. You want to be playing in the direction where your pawn chain is heading towards, where your pawn chain is looking towards. So in this case, as you can see, we have pawns in the center just like this. Imagine there was a pawn on c3. There would be a pawn chain going from b2 to c3 to d4 and e5. There actually was a pawn on c3. It's just that black played c5 and traded the pawns off. But there was a pawn chain that was looking this way, and the natural follow-up to this is this move f5, which if you prepare properly is what you should be trying to execute. So in a position like this, you can play a move like g4, knight to c4, bishop c1, and after a couple of moves later, properly setting up this move and trying to break through with f5. This is also an extension of the last rule, playing on the side where you're stronger, because you are legitimately playing on the side where you're stronger, because you're stronger on the side where your pawn chain is looking at. So the pawns are looking at the king side, you are stronger on the king side. So you want to be following the chain, you want to be playing on the side of the board where you're stronger. That's where you can crash through and create an attack. Now there's another one that I want to show you, and this rule right here is the rule of attacking all sides of the board. So in this position, after knight f to e5, well, first of all, I want to mention that all of the pieces here are developed, like both rooks, bishop, both bishops and the queen. For white, every single piece is developed. First of all, we improve this knight on f3. We put the knight in the center. We open up our bishop. Now all of our pieces are at their maximum capacity. We can even play e4. We can exchange a piece here. It is not a big deal. But the thing is, we are dominating the center. We have two pawns in the center. We have both bishops supporting these two pawns. The queen side is kind of locked right now, so there's nothing going on over here, nothing that we can do, at least right away. But what we can do is improve on the king side. So we can play moves like h4 and expand on this side of the board. And after bishop to d7, we can even play this move g4. So after we play this, we can even start an attack with g5. Now this traditionally might seem very bad, because why are we pushing the pawns in front of our king? However, we have to identify that our opponent cannot attack us because of how passive he is. The queen is on a6. How is it gonna jump? Is it just gonna jump over all the pieces and checkmate your king? No, the knight is the only one that's on the king side, and one lonely knight is not gonna do any damage. So actually, you're the one that's attacking here, and you're the one that has better pieces on this side of the board. So play on all three sides. And there's one more idea that I want to show you, and that is identify the plans of your opening and try to execute them to the best of your ability. Now, all of these rules that I just told you are sort of their major rules, and each of them can actually have a separate video on their own. In this case, I'm just going to be giving you just examples, and in the future I might do videos on these specific rules, expanding on them even more. But let me give you an example on this one right here. Identify the plans of your opening. And the bishop to d3, let's say. So what is the plan in the Caro-Kann? In the Caro-Kann, what you need to do is pressure this pawn on d4. So the pieces must reflect your plan. So you play a move like c5, pressuring the pawn. You play knight c6, pressuring the pawn. Castles. You bring this knight to e7 and f5 in the future, pressuring this pawn. You bring this queen to b6, pressuring this pawn. Every opening has a plan. In Caro-Kann, it's the pressure d4. In other openings, it's something different. For example, in d4, d5 positions, it's about controlling the e5 and the c5 squares. So you have to identify correct plans, and you have to identify correct plans for the openings and try to execute them as much as possible, okay? And these plans and candidate moves, they go hand in hand. You cannot have one without the other. So that's why I decided to include this part in this specific video as well. So these are some ground rules that will help you identify candidate moves, and these will guide you in your chess games. However, you gotta realize there's always gonna be some exceptions to these rules, so you always have to be very, very careful in your games. So that's going to be it for today's episode. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I will see you in the next one. Peace!